There is a story going around the internet, and the reasons people have for telling this story are maybe more interesting than the question of whether it is false or true. It ain't true. Like most stories on the internet, it's kind of a fabrication made up of ready-made facts, misappropriated and misassembled into something that in no way resembles the truth. But there is a story going around the internet about a YouTuber called Shoe0nHead. Why should you care? Why would I care? Why would anybody care? Shoe0nHead made the transition from being a comedy YouTube channel to being a pretty serious political commentary YouTube channel, notably during the fleeting candidacy of Bernie Sanders. Why does this matter to me? I regard Shoe0nHead as an idiot. I wish I had 10 friends like Shoe0nHead in my life. I wish I had 10 friends like her. Yeah, I'd prefer if they were smarter and more hardworking and more earnest than her. I wish they have all kinds of redeeming qualities she liked. But even in the absence of such redeeming qualities, sure, I wish I had 10 friends who were coming on the internet and trying to talk about politics and trying to talk about how to make the world a better place. And even if I regard Shoe0nHead as an imbecile, I can recognize that when she was covering and discussing the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, she was really sincerely motivated by trying to make the world a better place. And she's someone who is trying to give herself an education in politics and economics that she had never received, formally or informally. And with that, I can sympathize. If you take a look at her Instagram, she still presents herself as a sexy teenager. When I say teenager, like, she dresses up like a teenager or even like a child. She dresses up in school uniforms, schoolgirl skirts. She quite literally represents herself as being decades younger than she is. There's a kind of strangely infantile quality to her behavior on camera, and that originated as an imitation of another much more successful YouTuber known as Boxy. It's Boxy spelled with several X's. Boxy grew up. Boxy moved on. She has another YouTube channel where she films herself not playing that fictional character that she developed when she was a teenager herself. Boxy is now a middle-aged woman with a normal job. What videos she still has on YouTube about that time in her life are quite boring. Boxy grew up and moved on. There's part of Shoe0nHead that refuses to grow up and move on. And you know what? I can sympathize with that too. I can sympathize with wanting to keep this kind of insouciant, youthful vibe on camera persona. All right. But I think it insulates her against people really taking her seriously as a political commentator. The most recent image she posted of herself on Instagram is her doing a sexy pose in like a teenage schoolgirl uniform. And the written comment is, "You guys like me because of my quality political analysis." Right? Drawing attention to this fact that in fact a lot of people will be interested in this video because now she has broken up with her boyfriend. She's single, so the vultures are circling. And people want to know who is going to be Mr. Shoe0nHead, who's going to be her next boyfriend, who's going to be her husband, what have you. And her relationship with that boyfriend was very public and very publicly embarrassing. And they talked about their sex life, and there were a lot of things to be embarrassed about. Topic for another video. The story circulating the internet today is that, one, during her relationship with her boyfriend, she's now broken up with, she became more and more left-wing. And in her state of devastation after the breakup, she has now been lulled into socialism. She's been seduced into the slippery slope that leads to communism, that she has become more and more left-wing. In part because those people have reached out to her and been positive and supportive and kind at a time in her life when she was, frankly, vulnerable. Good story. The truth is much stranger, much simpler, but also much harder to believe. The truth is that Shoe0nHead today, and for many years, has been and still is a so-called left libertarian. She describes herself as a libertarian socialist or a socialist libertarian. a completely self-contradictory, ludicrous, and absurd political philosophy that has never commanded any significant percentage of the American public's attention, and I would like to say in this video, never will. Now, I think libertarianism itself is dumb. So it's not going to be surprising that I think left libertarianism and her particular version of left libertarianism is yet more dumb still. And I would note that in her period of support for Bernie Sanders, she never really dealt with the aspects of his political philosophy and his economic philosophy that really are conservative with a lowercase letter c. I've made many videos talking about those things, and no offense meant to Shoe0nHead, I don't think she read his book. I don't think she actually read Bernie Sanders' book in which he sets out what his political philosophy is, what his program for economic reform is, etc. So she was piecing together her opinion from just bits and pieces of information on Twitter. I really am morally opposed to the whole genre of YouTube videos that consist of people getting angry about things they've read on Twitter. Could we just evolve past that? And I would point out that someone on the far left, like Shoe0nHead, is just as guilty of this as Sargon of Akkad on the other side. Like, their idea of research is reading and contrasting some Twitter comments to one another and then getting animated, getting heated about it on camera. I have no respect for this mode of YouTube broadcasting. Let people read it on Twitter for themselves, or do your own research, or have some kind of better message to bring, in my opinion. Left libertarianism, or libertarian socialism, it's very difficult to understand in the abstract, and then it's easy to understand if we deal with palpable examples. Education. Do you believe that education should be provided by the state, by the government? Do you think compulsory education should be paid for by taxpayers? And yes, that people should be forced to put their children into a school where those children will learn how to use a condom, how birth control pills work, the theory of evolution, the fact that the earth is not flat, that it's round, the history of Sir Isaac Newton's discovery of gravity, the terrible history of colonialism, genocide, and slavery, a lot of things their parents might not want to teach them, right? I mean, even my own parents were really not comfortable with how awful the history of the British Empire was. They tried to flatter the British Empire in history. You got to go to school and learn some really sad things about history too. In England, they have huge problems with trying to force students to learn the history of the Holocaust. A lot of students grew up with parents who were Holocaust deniers, and then they come to school and there's a conflict with the teacher. You're going to teach kids the reality of what happened in World War II? And if not the government, then who? Libertarians, definitionally, by definition, libertarians are people who believe that education is better provided from private for-profit companies with as little involvement of the government as possible, or absolutely zero involvement from government and taxpayer subsidies. They want to disentangle education from the state. And if you ask them about this, they'll say ridiculous things like, well, back in the 1830s, the government didn't have any role in providing education and things were just fine. Oh yeah, there were no social problems back in the 1830s. There was no illiteracy. Back in the 1830s, there was nobody who believed the earth was flat, right? There was no problem with the baleful ignorance of the masses, especially. Oh yeah, and there was no problem with poor people lacking access to education, right? Like, the free market took care of it. You're like one Google search away from seeing just how terrible the world was in the 1830s and why there was the movement towards taxpayer-provided, state-required, mandatory education, right? Having an education system instead of the lack of a system, right? Very brief digression here. Many of you in the audience will have only had experience with state subsidy-provided education, government education. You may not have experience with the private sector alternative. Possible exceptions, you might have learned to drive a car from a private for-profit business. Music, you might have learned to play the saxophone or play the piano from a tutor or a private business that had no government involvement, no government regulation, no government oversight. You just paid on a fee-for-service basis for someone to come and teach you how to play the guitar or how to drive a car. It's possible you have had some very positive experiences with private education. My one positive experience is learning Chinese. I learned Chinese from a 100% private for-profit, no government subsidy, no government regulation, no government control institution. And I can speak positively about that experience. And I can even sit here and I could flatter the libertarian perspective on the world by comparing how awful my experience has been in high school, government high school, and university, government. I can sit here and talk about that. The Cree, the Ojibwe, the Mohawk, the Dene, the indigenous people of the great desert of the United States, like the Navajo, right? The Inuit, people living in poverty-stricken, remote areas. Who's going to provide them with education? All right, who's even going to provide them with access to learning how to drive a car? Like these kinds of things you may take for granted living in a big city. That's possible for a for-profit company to offer driving lessons and music lessons and maybe even Chinese lessons, right? Downtown New York City, there are maybe lots of private businesses doing that. Well, go out to the desert where the Navajo live. Go out to the swamps of, northern Ontario where the Cree and Ojibwe and those people live. Really ask yourself who is going to provide them with education. And of course, even within the big cities, the poorest 20% of people whose libertarianism is just a laughingstock philosophy. It is junk economics attached to junk politics wrapped up in a junk package that only idiots would buy, right? As it happens, a small number of incredibly wealthy and influential people have become passionate adherents to the libertarian philosophy in the 20th century and early 21st century. Alan Greenspan, tremendously powerful, influential guy. There were, at least one of the Koch brothers became very passionate about it. I'm not sure if all two or all three of them did, dabbled with libertarianism and committed this to one extent or another. So what is the prospect? What is the political potential of left libertarianism or libertarian socialism? In Shoe0nHead's own words, and this is where things get really contradictory, where libertarian socialism or socialist libertarianism starts to sound like hot ice or dry wet or square circle, it just becomes completely contradictory, is that she believes the government should only be involved in society in order to do good, not to do harm, I suppose. And then beyond that, the government should just stay the hell out and have no involvement. And her example, I kid you not, her example of this, of how she's still a libertarian, despite in some sense supporting a socialist state, is gun control. The government just shouldn't take anyone's guns away from them. Everyone should be allowed to be heavily armed. People should be allowed to have machine guns, rocket launchers, grenades. From her perspective, it just makes no sense for the government to regulate, restrict, take guns away from people. Now, that's an interesting contrast. Just a few years ago, she did actually make videos talking about gun control that I happened to see, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago now, so her position has changed. So she still wants to flirt with or retain some of this rugged individualist and indeed implicitly right-wing libertarian ideology while pretending to support state socialism in as much as it helps rather than harms people, okay? Let me tell you something about politics. In politics, you don't do good and you don't do evil. You do things. And you find out afterwards, sometimes tragically, decades afterwards, you find out which one of those things was good and which one was evil, which one worked and which didn't, which was harmful and which was helpful. You don't know. You can look at some of the worst disasters of the 20th century, including the disasters of communism, where not just millions of people died, but tens of millions of people died. And you can look at people involved in those projects and say that they had sincerely good intentions. There were people who had good intentions when they were putting bayonets into babies. I kid you not. And you can read history from their perspective. You can see it through their eyes and think what that was they were trying to accomplish. Unbelievably terrible atrocities are routinely committed and are still being committed to this day. And yes, because of the power of the state, more often than not, these things are done with taxpayers' money and they are done by governments, not by mere individuals. If you look at the greatest atrocities of the last few centuries, pretty much all of them seem to be paid for by taxpayers rather than being done by the free market. The free market's done some terrible things. Don't get me wrong. They've polluted some rivers. They've ruined some forests. But when you look at tens of millions of people dying in China under communism, it's hard for the free market to compete with it. When you look at Stalin, Hitler, Mao Zedong, it's hard for Coca-Cola to ever do something that terrible. I mean, the Bhopal disaster, there have been some, don't get me wrong. But yeah, state services, state authority, and the budget provided by the taxpayer tends to be involved in the greatest disasters in history. All right? You can't say that you only support socialism when it works. You can't say that you only support socialism when it's done for good and not evil. And you have to be willing to look back at the history of socialist experiments, not just the Soviet Union, not just China, a lot of really embarrassing failed socialist experiments in Africa, a lot of really embarrassing failed socialist experiments in South America, Latin America, right? You have to be willing to look at those situations and say, these people thought they were doing something good. They thought they were using the power and wealth of the state and the government to do something wonderful, and it was a disaster. And yes, in some cases, tens of millions of people died, and in some cases, look at what happened with Salvador Allende. Do you think he was trying to destroy the economy of his own country? Do you think he was trying to achieve hyperinflation or ruin the value of his currency? No, he was pursuing policies very much like the ones that are popular on the left wing of the Democrat Party in the United States today. People who are supporting MMT, people who are supporting printing tons of money and running the government into debt and thinking that it's infinite, thinking they're never going to hit a brick wall if they just keep spending billions of dollars. People get into their minds that they have good intentions and are pursuing good objectives, and you don't find out until afterwards. And often, all too often, you don't live long enough to find out at all. Okay? I don't expect Shoe0nHead to be brilliant, well-informed, or well-researched in her political opinions. I really do believe in freedom of speech within this kind of political frontier, if you like. I think it's a good and positive thing for someone like her to come here on YouTube and struggle to educate herself and make her own mistakes. And yeah, she's had periods of time where she was more right-wing, and now she's going through a period of time where she's more left-wing. I think her YouTube content is absolutely dreadful and awful and misleading and wrong. I wish I had 10 friends just like her. I wish I knew 10 other YouTube channels just like her that are engaged in a sincere struggle to make the world a better place, and where the personality you see on camera, however flawed, is in a sincere struggle with their own ignorance to become better informed, to become a better person.